Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Will the rollback of abortion rights split the United States in half, with women facing totally different laws depending on which state they live in? Let's get to the bottom line. Very few issues in American politics spark as much debate as a woman's right to abortion. This is the hottest of hot-button issues. For progressives and many moderates, it's about individual rights and a woman's right to govern her own body. For conservatives, it's about morality and the future of the United States as a Christian country. And wait, it gets worse. Each side of the debate looks down at the other with righteous contempt. Abortion took center stage in American politics after a draft ruling by the Supreme Court was leaked to the media. According to this draft, the court is set to vote on reversing a ruling made by the same court 50 years ago, known as Roe v. Wade, which gave federal protection to women having abortions. If the court goes through with the vote, then federal protections will disappear, and each state has to decide for itself what its abortion laws will be. That means it's going to be really messy, with political fights at each and every level of government, from local elections on up. So will this debate pour gas on a nation that's already divided and simmering with lots of internal resentments? And how can Americans reach a consensus on their major social issues like racism, same-sex marriage, gun control, immigration, what to teach kids at school, just to name a few? Today, we're talking with Jonathan Zimmerman, professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania and author of Who's America? Culture Wars in Public Schools. And also Andrew Hartman, professor of history at Illinois State University and author of A War for the Soul of America. And finally, Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill here in Washington, D.C. So great to have you all here with us today. Let me start with you, Julia. You know, a political bomb went off this last week with the leak of a draft opinion by apparently a majority of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court that said Roe v. Wade, this plank that nearly 50 years ago established federal protection of abortions for women in America, looks as if it is going to be overturned and changed. Can you just frame for our audience what a significant moment this is in American politics, and how is it shaping up for the political parties as we look forward?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I mean, when we talk about the significance of this moment, you know, I'm 29 years old. I have never lived in a world where Roe v. Wade was not law. And there are so many other women and, you know, Americans who feel the same way. So this is a seismic shift in how this issue of abortion, how this issue of choice is approached when it comes in the United States. So it's a major shift. And I think it's a major shift in the culture wars as well. You know, talking to members of pro-life advocacy groups and activists, they say this was a long time coming. This is 40 years in the making. And this is really, I think, the culmination of their efforts. And they view this as a major victory. But what's so interesting is the disconnect I very much view between conservative activists and the Republican establishment as a whole on this issue. You know, we've seen the Republican Party in general very much try ahead of the midterms to focus on crime, inflation, and the border. But you know, not really talking about abortion. But now they're being forced to talk about abortion. I think that's led many to wonder, you know, how in sync they are with the pro-life wing of the party and really how this impacts them politically. Over the past few months, over the past year even during the pandemic, we've seen Republicans win a number of major battles on the culture war front, whether that's critical race theory, LGBTQ issues, especially in Florida, for example, with the so-called Don't Say Gay bill or Parental Rights and Education Act. However, there's a lot of questions as to how well they can approach this issue of abortion going forward.
And it just, you know, begs this question of what's happened in this case to the Republican Party. You know, has the evangelical Christian movement, you know, taken over that party? Because, you know, I frankly, earlier in my youth, knew a lot of Republican supporters of a women's right to choose, of abortion rights in this country. They don't seem to be evident now, but has what kind of that part of the evolution is something that I think is interesting to make sure we put as part of the docket here.
They definitely seem to be the louder voices of the Party, but I do wonder whether they are actually the majority of the Republican Party as a whole, because you have figures in the establishment wing that would rather not talk about this issue of abortion, like I said, and focus more on those economic issues. However, I do think it's curious and telling that Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, said earlier this week that if Republicans were to win a majority in the midterms, that they would look at a national abortion ban. I think that, we'll see whether that's rhetoric or whether he's actually serious about it, depending what happens in the midterms. But I think there definitely is a divide within the Republican Party that still exists on how to approach this issue of abortion, especially when the majority of Americans, and polling shows this, are in support of preserving Roe v. Wade.
Andrew and Jonathan, I'm so glad you're on the show today, because I've read both of your work and admire you both. And this discussion of culture wars has been lurking behind a lot of other subjects, over many years. And, Andrew, I remember reading your book years ago, A War for the Soul of America. And I remember reading not yet President Biden's article in The Atlantic, about fighting for the soul of the nation after white supremacist protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he framed the title of his article was very much around the title of your book, and it just struck me at the time that your book kind of had the view, I think, that the culture war had been fought and that liberals had largely won. I haven't read the second edition, and so I imagine there's been an inflection point in there. But I'd just love to tell our audience how significant this moment is, and what do you suspect is going to happen? I'll ask Jonathan the same question by way of the next iterations of culture wars and their political ramifications.
Thank you, Steve. And I should just note that A War for the Soul of America is the title of my book, but I stole that from Patrick Buchanan from his famous 1992 speech at the Republican National Convention. In the first edition of my book, which was published in 2015, but most of which I had written in 2013 and 14, I had argued that the culture wars that we had seen sort of accentuated in the 1980s and 1990s had changed, and to some degree were over, in the sense that I thought that liberals had largely at least won the argument, even if that was not necessarily reflected in our politics. Of course, then Donald J. Trump announced his run for presidency, and that shifted a lot of things, and thus I wrote a second edition which argued otherwise. I do think that it's still the case that when it comes to American attitudes towards a lot of the issues that we define under the parameters of the culture wars, that the left or liberals have largely won the argument. And I think that's even true with abortion, as was mentioned previously, that a majority of Americans support Roe v. Wade. And I say that about abortion, even though that's one of the culture wars issues that has polarized Americans, I would say, more than others in the last 20 to 30 years. And yet, the Republican Party, in part, as mentioned, because conservative evangelicals in the last 40 to 50 years have largely captured that party, has been highly effective politically at winning a lot of these battles over culture wars issues, especially at the state level, and now increasingly, as we're seeing when it comes to the Supreme Court. So going forward, I think that we're in for some pretty rocky culture wars battles, given the fact that I continue to maintain that a majority of Americans lean a little bit left when it comes to a lot of these culture wars issues, and yet one of the two major parties is fully committed in many ways, especially at the state and local and grassroots level, to fighting the culture wars, and from a conservative perspective, and has been highly effective, highly organized, highly disciplined in doing so.
Well, thank you. Jonathan Zimmerman, what I've just always been inspired by you and your work is saying it's okay to have debates among contending views. Politics is not a kumbaya sport, but there was always this belief that both sides respected each other's rights, majority and minority, that there would be a struggle. And you've talked a lot about how that sense of civitas, or this respect for pluralism, has disappeared. And I'd love to get your framing on that, because I think since this moment, since I began reading you, I've seen nothing that gives me any hope that a respect for pluralism is coming back to this country?
The country was and continues to be extremely divided. And more than that, to your point, deeply polarized. You know, when I wrote about this matter back in the era you were talking about, the early 2000s, I was more concerned about the way that religion and religious claims polarized us, because often religious claims are totalizing, right? I mean, you know, it's like either he was the Messiah or he wasn't, right? Like either abortion is a sin or it isn't. And at that time, I imagined religion as being this force that was polarizing us and making us intolerant. What I think is so interesting and troubling about what's happened since is that the country has actually gotten radically less religious in every way we can measure, including self-reports about weekly worship and denominational affiliation. And yet no serious person thinks that it's gotten more tolerant. See, the story we liberals used to tell was that secularization would bring a kind of tolerance, a kind of cosmopolitanism or liberalism. And in fact, it's been the opposite. As we've gotten less religious, our political identities have in a way become our religions. And what that makes us is ever less likely to compromise or even listen to each other.
Well, let me ask you a question, Julia. You know, I've talked on this show with Senator Joe Manchin before, and, you know, he's out there, whether, you know, folks like him or not. What he says he's doing is he said, in this country, if we don't fight for a pragmatic middle again, for the kind of civility that Jonathan Zimmerman has said that we need to bring back to our schools and into our civic discourse again, that we're going to have a lot of other kinds of manifestations of January 6th, that if we don't really begin to proactively put people back together and have expectations of deal making down the road, this will happen. But his argument is that culture wars feed the fundraising machines of both parties, and that neither party has much incentive anymore to actually deliver results and products, you know, to the citizens who've elected them. You know, do you agree with Manchin? Does he have a point? How do others in the political spectrum see this?
Yeah, I think he absolutely has a point. You don't have to look farther than Virginia's gubernatorial elections last year. I mean, seeing how Republican now Governor Glenn Youngkin was really able to masterfully grasp onto the culture wars, especially when it came to schools, starting with those school closures during the coronavirus and morphing into more of a message about critical race theory and sexuality or sexual topics being taught in the classroom. He was able to grasp onto that and was able to very much galvanize the conservative base in Virginia, as well as rope in some independent or swing voters. Now, it wasn't, he didn't win by a landslide. However, he was able to very much turn the tide in Virginia, that in a Commonwealth or a state that was very much going in a left-leaning direction for a while. And we've seen, I think, a lot of Republicans, especially going into the midterms, try to replicate that because they know that that's something that is going to galvanize the conservative base. On the left, the liberal side, I think you see the same thing, especially when it comes to the issue of abortion. I think for Democrats, this the draft ruling that came out from the Supreme Court of the draft decision was, in a way, works for them well, because it allows them to galvanize their base, especially when it comes to Senate races, and warn that elections have consequences. So I think politically, the culture wars are able to galvanize those bases. They're able to contribute to fundraising. But I think it depends what impact. We have yet to see what impact that will have on swing voters. We saw it have a bit of an impact when it comes to schools on swing voters in Virginia, but I think we'll get more of an answer after November.
Andrew, I want to play a clip for you of Vice President Kamala Harris and a comment she made.
At its core, Roe recognizes the fundamental right to privacy. Think about that for a moment. When the right to privacy is attacked, anyone in our country may face a future where the government can interfere with their personal decisions. not just women, anyone.
Andrew, I guess my question to you is what comes next? Julia Manchester just talked about what Mitch McConnell said. You know, right now, the leading Republican in the United States Senate, they may try to pull off a national abortion ban. But when it comes to various dimensions of civil rights, same-sex marriage, various other rights that have been achieved in a kind of, I would call, the recent era, how vulnerable are those rights platforms? And are you going to see, as some people said, a real rollback to, some have said not just the 1950s, some politicians have said the 1850s, but I don't want to underscore that I agree with them, but I'm just sort of interested in whether or not there's real fragility in the constitutional basis for rights for many other groups in America.
So I think that there was always fragility in these rights that were won by many Americans from the 1960s onwards. Progress is never a guarantee, and I think that's particularly true when these rights are predicated on the courts. And so there were critics of the original Roe v. Wade decision from the left, from many feminists who argued that premising it on a right to privacy when that was a relatively new sort of consideration, judicially speaking, and that it was tenuous, always tenuous, was maybe not the right way to go. So what I foresee happening, I don't think we're gonna see a major rollback of rights, but what I foresee happening, hopefully, is that social movements will reemerge and will fight to legislate these rights as opposed to expect that their rights will be protected or guaranteed by the courts, especially when the Supreme Court is now a 6-3 conservative majority and likely to stay that way for a very long time.
How do we get the equilibrium right when it comes to teaching about identity and race in this country when it's become such a toxic political topic?
Well, it's a heavy lift. And just a couple points, Steve, based on what you just said. If you're talking about Virginia, I think a lot of polling indicates that it wasn't necessarily critical race theory or Toni Morrison's Beloved that helped Youngkin win. It was Terry McAuliffe saying that he thought parents should butt out of this. I think that was essentially an unforced error, and that's what sank him. And I think, this matches up with what Andrew was saying a moment ago. It seems to me that, if you're concerned about challenges and censorship in the school, the right answer, the right response is to organize yourselves. Not to say that other citizens shouldn't be engaged in the issue, but to engage in it yourself. And obviously, we're seeing some versions of that. To the thrust of your question about dialogue and discussion, it seems to me that we're at a moment where there is a lot of dissembling on both sides. I would say the most stark and the most obvious dissembling is on the Republican side. And thanks to figures like Chris Rufo, there are now lots of Americans who imagine that the fourth grade teacher is getting up at the beginning of class and saying, good morning, kids. It's time for your critical race theory lesson. And of course, this is ridiculous. I mean, this is a phantasm. That's not what's happening. And yet at the same time, to your point about Tulsa, I also think it's fair to say that in this country and in our schools, we are experiencing a new set of challenges about race. So take something like the 1619 Project. When Republicans say the 1619 Project represents a challenge to most traditional views of how American history is taught, I think they're right. I just think it's a good challenge and a necessary challenge. This is not to say that I think the 1619 Project should be inscribed as gospel in every classroom, because I do not. What I think should happen is that it should be introduced in every classroom alongside the state-approved textbook. And the first day it should be, okay, kids, what does the textbook say about discovery, quote unquote, and Columbus? What does the 1619 Project say about it? Which interpretation do you think is better? What would better mean? How do we know what we know? But to the point of your question, Steve, how many people on any side of this, quote, debate, unquote, actually want that? The point I've tried to make in my book is that, unfortunately, most people enter these arenas not because they want this thing that Zimmerman is calling a debate. It's because they want to see their own point of view privilege, and that's the heart of the problem.
If I did have an evangelical voice on this show today, I think they would make an impassioned statement about, how they see values and culture. And they have a right, it's a legitimate right to pursue their interests. But I guess the question I have is, again, coming to an equilibrium of what you think becomes possible, not lamenting the fact that change may be coming. This country's always coming. But how do you get it right where we can have a fabric of different perspectives in this country, over values, over norms, without the country ripping itself apart? I know that, and give me a 30-second answer on it.
Well, the United States has always experienced these types of struggles and has only ripped itself apart one time. So it is possible, and it's something we hope to avoid. But I think the circumstances in 1861 were vastly different. I don't think we're headed towards that. I think, Jonathan has the right solution. I think a lot of it starts with education, and it starts with us embracing alternative perspectives, but also recognizing that if we want change, we have to organize for change. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is just recognize there are differences in this country. There always will be. It's a huge country. Organize for change and accept defeat as well.
Well, thank you. And then finally, Julie, I don't know anyone who's more of a political junkie than you. And you and I are both going to be, and I think we all will, but looking very closely at the upcoming midterm elections in November. This is where our Congress, a big chunk of our Senate, are going to be elected. And I guess I would just ask you, what's going to be on the culture war menu between now and November, in addition to abortion, from your view?
I think a lot of it's going to circle around coronavirus, and many would argue, and I hope so, knock on wood, that we are, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I think you are also seeing Republicans continuously try to hit governors like Gretchen Whitmer, for example, in Michigan, saying that they were hypocritical during the coronavirus pandemic, that they handled that shutdown incorrectly, that they didn't do enough, to ensure that society remained open. So I think you're going to see Republicans sort of try to hearken back to that. And, on the issue of education, that's going to be a huge issue. And that sort of is related to coronavirus, especially when it relates to those shutdowns. So I think you're going to see Republicans really drive that narrative. At the same time, though, I think that's going to be lower on the docket for a lot of Republicans, at least at the Senate level. I think Republicans are mostly concerned about crime, inflation, and the border.
Well, listen, I just want to thank you all. This is a tough conversation. It's interesting. It's very conceptual for folks, particularly around the world, but I think you made it very real. I want to thank very much Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill, and Professors Jonathan Zimmerman and Andrew Hartman. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? You thought things couldn't get worse, didn't you? The disagreements about how Americans should live their lives have always been huge, and they're not going away. Once upon a time, Americans literally went to war against each other because they had totally opposite viewpoints on slavery. And they still disagree about waving the Confederate flag 150 years later. The big question is, will America be white, Christian-led nation, or will it shift to a multicultural society with no dominant religion or race? I thought the Constitution sort of took care of this stuff, but no. Will the U.S. government be more secular, or will it enforce religious-based morality? Do Americans still have a willingness to tolerate those who disagree with them? And what happens to democracy if they don't? I don't like to use the term culture wars because politicians like to use these issues to divide folks and raise donations and win elections. But sadly, that strategy is working for them. And that's the bottom line.